Simone Reardon set 3 medals on the glass counter of a pawn shop in Duluth, Minnesota, on a Tuesday morning in January, and told herself it was just metal. That was the only way to get through it, to treat the Army Combat Medic badge and the 2 commendation ribbons sitting under the fluorescent light like they were nothing. Old hardware, a yard sale find, not proof that she had once kept a man's heart pumping with the heel of her palm for 11 minutes on a gravel road outside of Kuwait City. Not proof that she had gone back into a collapsed aid station to pull out 2 soldiers she didn't know in the dark while the structure was still groaning. Not proof of anything except that she had at one point in her life been somebody worth recognizing. She was 31 years old. She had $42 in her checking account. Rent on her studio apartment in the East Hillside neighborhood was due in 9 days. She hadn't worked in 3 months. The man behind the counter had reading glasses pushed down to the tip of his nose. His name tag said Gunder. He picked up the combat medic badge and turned it in the light, squinting at it the way people squint at things they respect but aren't sure how to price. Army? He said. 4 years, combat Moss, got out in 2019. And then? Nursing school, R. He set the badge back down, lined the 3 pieces up in a neat row like he was arranging evidence, quoted her a number that was lower than she'd hoped and higher than she'd feared. Enough to cover the $1,100 she owed her landlord. Not enough to cover the electric bill that had been sitting on her kitchen counter for 2 weeks, the one with the red stripe across the top. She said she needed a minute. She turned and walked to the front window and stood there looking at the parking lot. Gray slush at the edges of the asphalt, a pickup truck idling near the entrance. And she breathed through her nose the way her therapist had taught her, counting to 4 on the inhale, 4 on the exhale. She hadn't been able to afford the therapist since November. She was doing the breathing on her own now. She had not cried since the morning they called to tell her the hospital's internal appeal had been denied. She was not going to cry in a pawn shop in Duluth at 9:40 on a Tuesday. She pressed 2 fingers hard against her sternum and breathed again. That was when she heard the door open. She didn't turn around immediately. She heard the low jingle of the entry bell, a man's boots on the concrete floor, and then a sound she wasn't expecting, the soft, controlled click of claws. She turned. He was maybe 45, wide through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been formed by argument. He wore a canvas work jacket and carried a paper coffee cup in one hand and a worn leather leash in the other. At the end of the leash was a Belgian Malinois, dark-muzzled, compact, moving with the smooth mechanical precision of a dog that had been trained for something serious. The vest across the dog's back was olive drab, with a small patch on the side, K9 Veteran. The dog's name, stitched in block letters below the patch, was Boone. Simone had stepped aside to make room. The man nodded at her in the general way men nod at strangers in small stores, polite, distracted. He was already scanning the display cases. He'd come in for something specific, she could tell. He wasn't browsing. But Boone was not moving. The dog had stopped walking. 3 feet into the store, on the worn rubber mat just inside the door, Boone had simply stopped and turned his head toward Simone. She watched it happen, watched the dog's whole body shift, watched his ears come forward and his nose start working, and then he was walking toward her. Not fast, not aggressive. Just deliberate, the way a dog walks when it has made up its mind. Boone, the man said, firm, quiet. The dog did not stop. Boone walked to where Simone was standing and sat down. He sat the way working dogs sit, spine straight, weight back, eyes up. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his head and pressed his face gently against her hand where it was hanging at her side. She felt his warmth go up her arm like heat from a radiator. She wasn't prepared for that. She hadn't been touched with any kind of gentleness in months. Not since her last shift 3 months ago, when one of the elderly patients in Bay 4 had taken her hand and said thank you and meant it. She had thought about that moment more than was probably healthy. "Ma'am, I'm sorry." The man was pulling the leash taut, but Boone wasn't moving. He doesn't usually. This isn't normal for him. "Boone, release." The dog stayed. He pressed closer against her hand, and Simone, without thinking, without planning to, brought that hand up slowly and rested it on the dog's broad head. "It's all right," she said. "He's not bothering me." The man stood there for a second with his jaw set and his coffee cup hanging at his side, watching his dog make a decision he hadn't authorized. Something shifted in his expression. He let the leash go slack. "Fletcher Dodd," he said, and offered his hand. "Simone Reardon." He glanced toward the counter, toward the medals sitting under the fluorescent light. He looked at them for a moment the way Gunder had, but differently. The way a person looks when they recognize something because they've worn it themselves, or stood next to someone who has. "Those yours?" he said. "Yes." "Combat medic badge." "Yes." He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Boone had still not moved from Simone's side. The dog just sat there, steady and warm, his ribs moving slow and even. "What happened?" Fletcher said. She almost said nothing. She had learned over the past 3 months to say nothing, because every time she told the story, she ended up watching people's faces go through the same sequence: sympathy, skepticism, the slow retreat into politeness. But Boone was leaning against her knee now, and she was tired, and the medals were sitting on the counter. So, she told him. It had started in August, 7 months ago, with a patient named Harold Getz. Harold was 68, a Vietnam-era Army veteran, admitted to St. Anselm Regional Medical Center in Duluth with a cardiac event. Not a full infarction, but close enough that he needed monitoring and a medication protocol that cost the hospital real money to maintain. Simone had been his floor nurse for 4 days. She knew his chart. She knew his dosage schedule. She knew that on day 3, someone had changed his medication from the brand name formulation to a cheaper generic, without a physician order attached to the change and without notifying his cardiologist. She had flagged it, followed procedure, filed a formal incident report through the hospital's internal system. 3 days later, Harold Getz was discharged. 2 days after that, he was back in the ER with a secondary cardiac event. He died the following morning. His daughter, a woman in her 50s named Judith, stood in the hallway outside his room and cried quietly with her hands covering her mouth. And Simone stood there too, not knowing what to say, not saying anything. The incident report Simone had filed had disappeared, not archived, not resolved, disappeared. When she went back into the system to find it, there was no record it had ever been submitted. She filed a second report. She sent an email to the chief nursing officer. She documented everything: dates, times, the names of the charge nurse and the floor supervisor who had been on duty when the medication was changed. She had been thorough because she had been trained to be thorough. Combat medicine had taught her that sloppy documentation got people killed. 2 weeks later, she was called into a meeting with Craig Sutter, the hospital's chief administrative officer. Sutter was 53, with silver hair and the particular brand of blandness that comes from decades of sitting in rooms where real decisions are made and emerging untouched. He told her, in the precise vocabulary of a man who had taken a course in how to fire people without liability, that her employment at St. Anselm was being terminated effective immediately. The reason cited: unsubstantiated allegations disrupting hospital operations and a pattern of insubordination. He gave her a termination agreement. She did not sign it. "He offered me 3 months severance if I signed," she told Fletcher. "Standard NDA. I walk away quietly, he makes it go away." "You didn't take it." "No." "Why not?" She looked down at Boone for a second. "Because Harold Getz's daughter sat in that hallway for 4 hours. Because someone changed that medication and then erased the record. And because 3 months' pay doesn't cover that." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Gunder had gone somewhere in the back. It was just the 3 of them, the man, the woman, and the dog. "You filed an appeal," Fletcher said. It wasn't really a question. 2. Both denied. The hospital's process is internal, which means Sutter's office reviews appeals of decisions made by Sutter's office. She kept her voice flat because that was the only way she could talk about it without the anger getting too loud. "I filed a complaint with the Minnesota Board of Nursing. They're still reviewing. I filed with OSHA, whistleblower protection claim. Also still pending. I've been living on savings. The savings ran out 6 weeks ago." She looked at the medals on the counter. "I've been eating oatmeal for breakfast and whatever the food shelf gives out on Wednesdays. My electric bill is 3 weeks overdue. Rent is in 9 days." She paused. So, Fletcher put his coffee cup down on a nearby display case. He looked at the medals, then at her, then at Boone, who was still sitting at Simone's knee like he'd been assigned there. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "Can you wait 20 minutes?" She waited 40. Fletcher stood outside in the parking lot with his phone pressed to his ear, walking slow circles in the slush. Simone sat in the one chair near the front window, a wooden stool, really, the kind that exists in small stores for the purpose of making people feel less like they're waiting to be processed. Boone lay down across her feet. She could feel his weight through her boots. She found out later that Fletcher Dodd had spent 8 years in the Army as a Special Forces medic before a training accident took him out of the field. He'd spent the following decade building a one-man operation, informally structured, non-profit funded, that helped veterans navigate the Byzantine wreckage of bureaucratic injustice. VA claims, wrongful discharges, medical negligence cases inside the military health system. He had a network of attorneys, a retired JAG officer in Minneapolis named Doris Aldenhoff, who specialized in federal whistleblower cases, and a working relationship with the regional office of the Inspector General's office that he'd earned the hard way over 15 years. He had come into the pawn shop that morning to sell a guitar. When he came back inside, he didn't say much. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket and handed it to Simone. "Doris Aldenhoff," he said. "She's already waiting for your call. She thinks you have a federal case, not just Minnesota. If Sutter's been falsifying billing records to Medicare, which is what it sounds like, that's a False Claims Act violation. The federal government takes those seriously." Simone looked at the card. "I can't pay an attorney. Doris works contingency on false claims cases. If the government finds fraud, she gets a percentage of the recovery. You pay nothing up front." He paused. "Also, I talked to a friend at the IG's office. They already have St. Anselm on a short list. You're not the first person who's complained about Sutter's cost-cutting. You'd just be the first one with documentation." "My incident reports were deleted from the internal system." He looked at her steadily. "Did you email anything?" She thought about it. The email to the CNO. She'd sent it from her hospital account, but she'd also sent a copy to her personal email because she was meticulous, because 4 years of military documentation habits don't leave you easily. She had a copy of every email, every timestamp, every response and non-response. She had taken screenshots of the incident report before it disappeared. She had saved them to her phone and then to a folder on her laptop because she had, somewhere in the back of her mind, suspected that this was coming. She told him that. For the first time since she'd walked into the store, Fletcher Dodd smiled. It was brief, controlled, the smile of someone who had seen enough bad outcomes to respect the significance of a good one. "Then you have a case," he said. The next 6 weeks were the hardest of her life in ways that were different from the hard she'd known before. Combat hard was fast and physical and present. Your body knew what to do because it had been trained, and afterward you either dealt with what had happened or you didn't, but the event itself was usually over. This was slow hard. Conference calls with Doris Aldenhoff at 7 in the morning, documentation reviews that lasted 3 hours, the careful work of reconstructing a paper trail from screenshots and email metadata and the witness statements of 2 other nurses, both of whom had left St. Anselm in the past year, both of whom had signed the NDA Simone had refused, both of whom were, it turned out, still angry. Their names were Carla Weston and Priya Suresh. Carla had been a charge nurse for 11 years. Priya had been a clinical pharmacist who'd flagged the same pattern of unauthorized generic substitutions that Simone had reported. Both of them had signed the settlement. Both of them, when Doris called and explained that a federal investigation meant their NDAs were unenforceable against a government inquiry, agreed to talk. Sutter's operation had been running for at least 2 years. The system was simple and difficult to trace. When a patient's insurance was Medicare or Medicaid, certain medications were quietly swapped for cheaper alternatives without physician authorization. The cost difference was pocketed in the departmental budget, which made Sutter's cost reduction numbers look extraordinary, which was the metric by which the hospital board evaluated his performance, which was why his salary had been increased twice in 18 months. Harold Getz had not been the first patient harmed. The federal investigators, once Doris gave them Simone's documentation and connected it to the IG's existing file, found evidence of at least 4 other adverse events that mapped to the same substitution pattern. One of them was a 90-year-old woman named Edna Percival, who had died in March. Her family had been told it was natural causes. Simone did not sleep the night she learned about Edna Percival. She sat in her studio apartment with Boone. Fletcher had started bringing him by in the evenings, and somewhere in the second week it had become routine, and somewhere in the fourth week she stopped noticing it was unusual, and she sat on the floor with her back against the couch and her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold, and she thought about Edna Percival's family and Harold Getz's daughter Judith in the hallway with her hands over her mouth. Boone put his head in her lap. She pressed her palm flat against the broad warmth of his skull and stayed there until the ceiling went gray with early light. The Minnesota Board of Nursing held its formal inquiry in February. Doris Aldenhoff appeared alongside Simone, and the documentation they presented, emails, screenshots, the witness statements from Carla Tweston and Priya Suresh, and a forensic accounting summary provided by the federal investigators, was entered into the record in 412 pages. Sutter's attorney argued process, argued jurisdiction, argued that the documentation was circumstantial and that the incident reports had been deleted due to a routine system migration, not suppression. The board's review panel had received, separately, a letter from the family of Harold Getz, written by his daughter Judith, describing what she had been told about her father's final hospitalization and asking whether someone had, in fact, been trying to tell the hospital what was happening to him. The letter had been submitted at Doris's invitation. Judith Getz had written it at her kitchen table in Hibbing, Minnesota, in one sitting and mailed it without revision. The panel read it into the record. Simone sat at the table with her hands folded and her back straight, and she did not look at Sutter. She had decided 3 weeks earlier that she was not going to look at him, not out of theatrics. Just because she had spent 3 months not sleeping, not eating properly, selling the things that mattered to her one at a time. Her grandmother's ring at the end of November, her camera equipment in December, and finally the medals in January, and she had decided that the only person in that room worth looking at was the panel. The board suspended St. Anselm's operating certification pending a full compliance review. The federal investigation was, by that point, already underway. The Department of Justice does not move quickly, but when it moves on a False Claims Act case, it moves with weight. Craig Sutter was placed on administrative leave by the hospital board the following Monday. 18 months later, he would plead guilty to federal healthcare fraud. The hospital board issued a formal statement. Simone had wanted the statement to be read aloud at a specific meeting, and Doris had made that happen. A board member named Harriet Voles, a woman in her 60s who had the expression of someone who had recently been told something she wished she could unknow, read the statement from a podium. It acknowledged that the termination of Simone Reardon had been unjust and retaliatory. It acknowledged that internal incident reports had been improperly suppressed. It stated that St. Anselm Regional Medical Center offered an unqualified apology to Simone Reardon, to the families of Harold Getz and Edna Percival, and the others whose names were in the report, and to the clinical staff who had been coerced into silence. Harriet Voles read the whole thing without looking up from the paper. When she finished, the room was very quiet for a moment. Simone looked straight ahead. She was reinstated in March with full back pay covering all 22 weeks of her termination. $14,312 deposited to her account on a Wednesday morning. She stood in her kitchen with her phone in her hand and looked at the number and did not quite believe it was real for several minutes. She paid the electric bill first, then the rent arrears. Then she walked to the grocery store 6 blocks from her apartment and bought actual food, chicken thighs, a bag of sweet potatoes, coffee that wasn't the store brand, a container of good yogurt, and she stood in the checkout line and thought about nothing in particular, which was a relief so enormous she had to breathe through it. She went back to St. Anselm in April, but not to the same floor. She had negotiated through Doris to return to the ER, where she'd started before they'd moved her to the medical floor and where she'd always functioned best, The ear moved fast, and the fast helped her. On her first day back, Carla Weston, who had also been offered reinstatement and had accepted, was standing by the nurse's station when Simone walked in. Carla looked at her for a second. Then she handed her a cup of coffee and said, "You look like you haven't slept since October." "About that long," Simone said. "Good, neither have I." Carla turned back to her charts. "Let's get to work." Fletcher came by the apartment a few weeks later with Boone, the way he usually did on Thursday evenings, and they sat on the small balcony that looked out over the street and drank coffee because it was finally warm enough to sit outside. Boone had arranged himself across the doorway, with his nose pointed toward the balcony, and his eyes half closed in the particular contentment of dogs who know exactly where they're supposed to be. "I keep thinking about Harold," Simone said. "Yeah," Fletcher said. "I can't fix that part. The board's decision, the federal case, none of it fixes that part." "No." She looked at the street. April in Duluth meant the last patches of gray snow in the gutters and the first real light in the trees. Bare still, but lit. "I keep thinking if I'd pushed harder in September, if I'd gone to the IG directly instead of going through the internal process first." Fletcher turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Simone, the internal process was the right thing. You followed protocol. The protocol failed, not you." She knew that. She had been told that by Doris, by the board, by her own rational mind at 3 a.m. Knowing it and feeling it were different projects. "Boone made a decision in about 4 seconds," she said. "Just walked right over and sat down. Didn't need any internal process." Fletcher laughed, short, real. "He's a better judge than most people I know. I stopped questioning him a long time ago." Simone looked at the dog in the doorway. Boone had one ear tilted toward her the way he did when he was tracking a sound or a voice. "What did he smell?" she said, "when he came over. Do you know?" Fletcher shook his head. "Not exactly. He was trained for search and rescue, but he was also a comfort animal for a veteran's residence before I got him. He spent 2 years working with people who'd been through things. I think he paused, looking for the right word. "I think he knows what quiet courage smells like. The kind people carry when they've done hard things and aren't advertising it." Simone didn't say anything. She looked at Boone. He had lifted his head and was looking back at her with the calm, clear attention of an animal that has no interest in flattery or pretense, only in the fact of a person, present here, real. She reached across the doorway and rested her hand on his head. He closed his eyes. The medals were at the bottom of her closet now, in the same small box where they had always lived, not on a shelf, not displayed, just kept. She had gotten them back from Gunder the week after the reinstatement money came through. He had held them for her, he said, on purpose. Hadn't processed the transaction. Said something felt wrong about it, and he'd learned a long time ago to listen to that feeling. She hadn't been sure what to say to that, so she'd just thanked him. She thought sometimes about what it meant that a dog and a pawnshop owner had both understood something in the span of a few minutes, that a hospital administrator, a board of directors, and an internal appeals process had failed to grasp over the course of 5 months. She didn't have a clean answer for that. She wasn't sure there was one. What she knew was this. She had walked into a pawn shop in January to sell the most irreplaceable things she owned, and she had walked out with them still in her hands. That was not nothing. In the kind of winter she'd had, that was almost everything.